Hello, World History 1 students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video all about the spread of Judaism. We're going to talk about the reasons that Judaism spread, and you need to answer this question: why did Judaism spread? Convenient. In 3 to 4 sentences at the end of the video. So this is our second video on Judaism. And if you've heard of Judaism or the Jewish people before, you probably learned about it in middle school. You probably learned about the Holocaust and the way that Jews were persecuted by the German people in the 1930s, leading up to World War II and then throughout World War II. But the Jewish people have a long history of being oppressed by different groups of people in different places. And oppressed just means treated badly, persecuted, picked on, singled out for bad treatment. The Jews, for example, were persecuted in Egypt. In the Torah, in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah, it describes the Jews being enslaved for generations in Egypt, being forced to do hard manual labor against their will. And the book of Exodus, the Torah, tells the story of how a prophet named Moses was born and how he helped to lead the Jews out of Egypt. So remember, a prophet is somebody who's able to talk to God. And in this case, Moses talked to God about, God spoke to Moses and said, these are the steps you need to take to get the Jews out of Egypt. This is an example of how the Hebrew God gets involved in the history of the Jewish people. And this process of leading the Jews out of Egypt and getting them out of slavery was called Exodus. And that's why the book that the story is told in is called Exodus. And here, as part of that story, you can see an illustration of Moses using the power of God to separate the Red Sea. In order to get away from Egypt, the Jews needed to cross the Red Sea. They were being chased by the Pharaoh and his soldiers. And so through Moses, God, the Hebrew God, parted the Red Sea, according to the Torah, and made dry land for the Jews to walk through, and they were able to escape. Following that, Moses went up a mountain, Mount Sinai, where he spoke to God further and where God gave him a list of laws, religious laws that the Jewish people should follow. And these laws, you've probably heard of them before. They're called the 10 Commandments. Some of the 10 Commandments are laws that are very specifically about how the Jewish people needed to treat each other, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, don't covet thy neighbor's wife. And then there's also laws that govern how people should treat God. So like, don't have any other gods except the one Hebrew God, and don't say the name of God in vain, and remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So like, don't work on Sunday. So the 10 Commandments are a religious law, a religious set of religious laws, which are in the Torah and which the Torah says were received by Moses from God. This is another example of theocracy, right? This is laws, which is the job of government, coming from God. And I basically just said all of that stuff, forgot that I had a whole PowerPoint slide about it. Look at that. So these laws are recorded in the Torah, and they're based on morality and justice. This is very different from a previous set of laws that we talked about, right? Like these laws, they're all about trying to do the right thing and making sure that fair things happen in the world. And our previous law code that we talked about, I wonder if you can remember. Gary remembers. Yes, Gary. Okay, you can tell me what the name of the previous law code was. Yes, it was the Code of Hammurabi. Good job, Gary. Good. This is why you have an A. I'm very proud of you. The Code of Hammurabi was all about revenge, right? Like, so you did a bad thing, and now we're going to do that bad thing to you. But the 10 Commandments don't describe punishments. They just say, don't do these 10 things. Okay, so after Moses leads the Jews out of Egypt and he gets the 10 Commandments, gives them these laws that God wants them to have, the Jews go back to their homeland of Canaan in the Jordan River Valley, and they settle in this city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, to this day, is a really important city in Jewish history. It was the site of the first Jewish temple. And they built this temple, and they believed that like this was like a house for God to live in. And eventually, however, the Jews were forced to leave Jerusalem. I'm like getting ahead of my PowerPoint slides. This is like rookie stuff here, Mr. Everton. So eventually the Jews were exiled from Israel. The Jews were forced to leave. They were forced to leave Jerusalem when they were attacked by the Babylonians. This empire from Mesopotamia came and they attacked the Jews and took them over, and they burned Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple. They burned the temple to the ground. They destroyed God's house. And this is what we call the Babylonian captivity. Because during this time period, a lot of times, if your city was taken over, right? If you were conquered by an empire, one way that they would try to control people is that they would deport them. They would take them away from their homeland and force them to go live somewhere else. So hundreds of Jewish people were deported from their homeland of Israel. They were sent to live in Babylon and in other parts of Mesopotamia away from their homeland. And when they did that, they brought their belief system with them. The thing that comforted them, that made them feel better as they were forced to go live far away from the only land they ever knew, was forming a community with the other Jews who were there. And through remembering their religious tradition and their religious laws. Sorry about the bell. This is what we call the diaspora. The word diaspora means spreading out, taking a people who lived in one spot and spreading them out to a bunch of other places. So when the Jews were taken captive by the Babylonians, it spread them all across Mesopotamia. And eventually, many Jews did return to Jerusalem, but many of them didn't, and they continued to live all around Mesopotamia. Later, and this is much later, the Jews would have a similar thing happen with the Romans. The Romans would take over Israel, and they would destroy the Hebrew temple, and the Jews would leave. They would flee to get away from the Roman sacking of Jerusalem, and eventually they would spread out across the world. So today, the two countries in the world that have the most Jewish people living in them are the United States and also Israel. And Israel is the site of the traditional Jewish homeland where the city of Jerusalem is located. And it's a country that was created after World War II in response to the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust was so terrible and because Jews were so persecuted, the United Nations created a country in the traditional Jewish homeland called Israel for them. So, by the way, this is a picture of the remains of that Hebrew temple that is still in Jerusalem. It's called the Western Wall, and it's a pilgrimage site. It's a place where many Jews today, even now, go to Jerusalem and pray at this wall. Today we talked about Moses, who was a prophet. We talked about the Ten Commandments, which are a set of religious laws that are written in the Torah, the Jewish holy book. We talked about the importance of the city of Jerusalem. We talked about the exile from Jerusalem and how that led to the diaspora, or the spreading out of Jewish people around the world. Thanks very much for watching. I will talk to you next time.